Hello, welcome to Sit and See. I'm Dr. Jared Jones. My research specialties are ancient systems of meditation, the cognitive science of meditation, Buddhist philosophy, and the philosophy of science. I'm putting myself out there on the internet because after many, many years of trying a lot of different meditation techniques, studying a lot of academic stuff related to meditation, I found that speaking for myself, it seems that a fair number of things work in real life and a fair number of things are quite difficult to make work in real life in terms of meditation training. And as such, having done a fair amount of retreat and having done a fair amount of practice amidst the things of the world, I decided, on the advice of my teachers and with the guidance of my teachers, that I'd start to try to bring these ideas to the wider world. So that's why we're here today doing Sit and See. Hey, Dave, welcome. Let me get something done here. So, for those of you who aren't aware, I've been training as a Buddhist for about 21 years in the Gelug Tibetan Buddhist school and the Dragon Gate lineage of Taoism for another 6, overlapping with my Gelug training. So, I've been training in meditation for a while. I'm not just an academic. Wonderful Hinduism article. Oh, just the post? Yeah, that's very cursory. There's going to be a video on it eventually. I just have to get the resources together because I want to make sure that when I make the video on that subject that I'm using the most up-to-date research from the field. I don't want to be using stuff from 20 years ago because things do move in academia, you know. But unfortunately, I was talking with one of my professors who specializes in that area, and the resources she sent me, just the books were like 300 or 400 pounds just to get the books. So I thought I would put that off for just a bit. Figured I could jump into that video and get it going because I already had a pretty good idea of what I wanted to do, and then yeah, ended up ended up needing to wait a bit because I'll have to get all the books together and so forth. But nonetheless, there is a video coming on that subject that'll be much more thorough. But yeah, it's quite fascinating. Let's see who's here. Luck 108, Data Daddy, Jessamine. Welcome, welcome. So, what can I say? So, one of the interesting bits of research that I've read to give you guys a sneak peek, there's been a fair amount of digging to try to sort out what the Shakyans believed prior to the the invention of and spreading of Buddhism beyond that sort of the foothills of the Himalayan region. And what's quite interesting is that there were a few centers of power for Brahminical power at the time, and the Shakyans were located sort of just outside that. And according to one of the scholars I was reading, the Shakyans weren't even officially in the caste system. They were simply because of being under the rule of those who believed in a caste system relegated into it by default, right? Because they have to be classified as something, and thus they were classified under the warrior class. But in reality, the Shakyans didn't believe any of that. If we're going by the archaeological evidence, they were practicing a different form of religion. Basically, they weren't following the Vedic traditions. So that's quite interesting, uh, all by itself. They were basically as a community, they were sun worshippers, according to this scholar's work that I was looking at, and I'm interested to see what his evidence is for this. But it wouldn't have been uncommon at the time, actually, for people to be of that kind, because sun worship, as you maybe know, in the ancient world was extremely common. So that might be part of the content of the video upcoming, and maybe not. But it's also quite interesting to note that at the time of the Buddha, there was there were certain cities that were the centers of power for Brahmanical power, and the Brahmanical powers were basing their structure of society and so forth on the teachings in the Vedas. But there were also amongst those groups and spread out across the relatively small area of Brahmanical power, there were Upanishadic groups following a few of the Upanishads. This is what the evidence seems to relay to us. But a very small number of Upanishads. Today we have something in the ballpark of 200. Depends on who you ask. Maybe around 100, maybe around 200 Upanishads. At the time, the best we can figure, there were maybe four or five. So also there's the oldest texts indicate that there were only three Vedas at that time, and now we have four Vedas. So it's a little bit unclear actually about what all of these groups were doing, and clearly the Upanishadic groups didn't all agree with each other, because in the sources we have coming through the Buddhist canon, at least, people were confused by different teachers coming by and relaying different teachings based upon different Upanishadic traditions and so on and so forth. On top of that, there was this huge movement of renunciates called Shramanas, and the Shramanas were uh, had all sorts of ideas. But one of the big ones was, just like the Buddha, that they wanted to reject the world, move away from the world, and figure out whatever in terms of spiritual practice. They wanted to figure out whatever the highest spiritual goals were by rejecting the world in a physical sense. And they had all sorts of ideas, as far as we can tell. On top of this, there were what the Buddhist canon label as the heretical teachers. And the heretical teachers, some people in the online communities will say, "Oh yeah, but nobody really believed any of that, and those things were really small pockets of ideas." No, that's not true, because one of those schools, for example, was survived for, I think, something like 300 or 600 years after the time of the Buddha, and became the Charvaka school, which were materialists who said the only thing that exists is the material world. And when you die, your body breaks up. Since the body broke up, you cease to exist. You are the body. When you die, when the body dies and breaks apart, you cease to exist, and that's it. Right? So this was a relatively popular school from the time of the Buddha, continued to develop, and became the Charvaka school, which lasted something like 300 years or 600 years, if I can't remember which. So also at the Buddha's time, there were agnostics. There was a whole group of people who said, basically, we can't know anything beyond a very limited number of things, which again, you find very common as a very common sort of approach that people take nowadays. They say, well, we just can't know a whole bunch of stuff. And I can't take the word of some meditator guy that a bunch of this stuff is real. I can't know that. And so I just have to throw my hands up and say, I can't know. I'll never know. Nobody really knows. Probably that meditator guy also doesn't know. He's lying. Right? And the Buddha said, I reject this approach. I reject this position. So the Buddha rejected materialism. He rejected agnosticism. He rejected a number of ideas from the Vedas. He rejected a number of ideas from the Shramanas, who were saying that if you mortify your body and expose it to heat and expose it to cold and expose it to pain and expose it to starvation and these other things, that you can achieve realization in this way. So the Buddha went around and sort of how to say, interacted with what was there. And it wasn't just like the Buddha, sometimes people say the Buddha is like the Protestant Reformation of Hinduism. But first of all, we didn't have what we would call today Hindu practice. We didn't have that yet. We had a few of the Upanishads. We had maybe 3 of the Vedas. So and they hadn't yet incorporated the local gods into the Brahmanical practices. Um, and we didn't have any of the later commentarial traditions beyond the Upanishads, right? So, based upon what was available, in a very rough sense, it would be like saying, if we were to use an Abrahamic example, it would be like saying that the Buddha was responding to Christianity. And you would go, what do you mean he was responding to Christianity? Jesus hadn't even been born yet. And they would go, yeah, but the Torah existed, right? And there were Jews and they believed in God. Yeah. And they had some vague ideas at that time of the afterlife. Yeah. Okay, then he was responding to Christianity, right? Well, no, because Christianity had a whole new text. They had a whole new saint. They added all these extra ideas, and there were all these other developments in between. And then the church fathers incorporated Greek philosophy and added all these other ideas into the canon. That the Buddha wasn't responding to Christianity. He was responding to like the earliest, not the earliest, but relatively early Jewish ideas by way of analogy, right? Because obviously he wasn't responding to that. He was responding to what was there. So what we have in the Hindu canon at that time, what we might call the Hindu canon today, was maybe 3 of the Vedas, maybe all 4 were there, but the earliest sources only talk about 3 of them. And then maybe 5 of the Upanishads, and we have somewhere between 100 and 200 Upanishads today. And then on top of that, there are the great epics. The great epics are a huge part of the interpretive lens that's applied backwards onto the Upanishads and the Vedas to help modern Hindus make sense out of them. We didn't have any of them. So, you know, it's a bit like saying you had Christianity before you had Jesus and before you had the Bible. You know what I mean? It's it doesn't quite work to say that you had, and they didn't incorporate the local gods yet from the various peoples that were around, and but were not Brahmanical in terms of their beliefs. So again, it's a weird argument unless you're making a religious argument and you're saying, well, no, Hindu Dharma is what do they say? Sanatan Dharma is eternal Dharma. It's always been true. Well, that's fine. But the Christians say that their truth has always been true, and the Buddhists say their truth has always been true. And I'm sure half a dozen other religions also say their truth has always been true. The Muslims say that their truth has always been true. So that's a religious argument, which is fine for insiders, but doesn't work from a historical critical perspective at all. So in any case, yeah, there's much more on this coming. Much more on this coming. I just want to make sure I'm using the best modern research to make sure that I'm not making arguments that are now out of date. But yeah, Buddhism was not responding to Hinduism. This is extremely important. And Buddhism is not somehow equivalent to the Protestant Reformation of Catholicism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The Buddha was responding to dozens and dozens and dozens of different philosophical ideas, religious movements, etc. And ultimately, when you do a close reading of the critical elements of Buddhism, there goes Luck deleting comments again. Luck, just so you know, I read your comments before you delete them, so I already know what you said. uh, where was I? That was too funny, and I got distracted. So when you look at the critical teachings of the Buddha wasn't responding to anyone. The most critical elements of Buddhism, he's not responding to any of his contemporaries. He has to use words, right? And those words will be words shared in common in his culture. But the Buddha, in terms of his definitions for the terms, is not simply responding to an adversarial definition for the term found in another tradition. because that definition isn't found in another tradition. Now, will elements of that definition counteract some other definitions that are around? Yeah, because from a Buddhist perspective, innately you have a type of psychological condition in which you see things, you see them pre-philosophically, pre-religiously, pre-scientifically. You see them existing in a way they don't exist. And you understand them from your perception to exist in a way they don't exist. That's perceptual and pre-philosophical, pre-religious, pre-scientific. And therefore, when the Buddha says you have ignorance, he's not saying you believed the wrong religion. This is really important. He's not saying you believed the wrong idea about the soul because you learned the Vedas. How do we know? Because the Buddha said fleas have ignorance. The Buddha said worms have ignorance. The Buddha said the gods have ignorance. The Buddha said hell beings have ignorance. The Buddha said beings between lives have ignorance. The Buddha said beings who are countless kalpas in terms of distance away in the trikolocosm of the universe have ignorance, who've never even heard the word Veda or Upanishad. So the Buddha isn't responding to another philosophical view or religious view. The Buddha is responding to the fact that you have an innate cognitive problem, that your mind sees things in a way they don't exist. Now, why will you find that the Buddhist definition of self, for example, contradicts other views of self you find in other philosophies? Because those views, according to Buddhism, come out of the fact that you're seeing it wrongly in the first place. So you see it wrongly, and then you start trying to define things based upon having seen them wrongly. So elements of your definition, elements of your way of understanding what the self is, when you start trying to put it into words and philosophical statements and arguments, will be wrong because it's based upon your wrong perception in the first place. But that's not what we're actually going after. Because in your deepest state of concentration, here's another wonderful argument if you'd like one. The Buddha attained the highest possible, subtlest possible states of concentration, which a little bit of debate we could have about this, but neither perception nor non-perception, right, could be equivalent to Brahmana Atman. Okay? So could be. There's some debate about this. If it is, then the Buddha attained the highest, subtlest, most difficult state of non-conceptual concentration. And after doing this and spending time in it, returns to his ordinary mind and says, being in that state of concentration didn't remove my ignorance. Even in the subtlest type of concentration, this ignorance is still there. So it's not a conceptual problem. It's not a philosophical problem. It's not a problem where you have gotten your ideas wrong. Although, yes, 108, wrong views are a problem because if you believe the wrong stuff, if you accept the wrong philosophies, you will go the wrong way because you've been convinced that by blowing yourself up, you're going to go to a heavenly realm. If you believe that blowing yourself up leads to heavenly rebirth, you're going to have problems from a Buddhist standpoint when you blow yourself up and end up in a hell realm instead. That's going to be a big problem for you. So your wrong view leads to things you don't want. However, that wrong view isn't actually what we are directly counteracting with wisdom. What we're directly counteracting with wisdom is your innate ignorance, your misperception of how things exist that is pre-philosophical, pre-religious, pre-scientific. Has nothing to do with your ideas about the world, your religious ideas, philosophical ideas, scientific ideas, has nothing to do with that. Except for the fact that those things will be different if you realize wisdom, right? Of course, they'll be different. They'll change. And some of them you won't be able to hold on to anymore in the same way that you did. A bomb. Not the ego. So like this, Buddhism, very critical, is not responding to a bunch of philosophical ideas in a general, in terms of its general presentation of the core ideas of its system. What it's responding to is our innate ignorance and our innate misperception that's preconceptual. Fleas have it, worms have it, fish have it, humans have it, dogs have it, gods have it. The beings resting in the subtlest states of formless concentration, in the formless realms, they have it. The beings in the lowest hells, they have it. It has nothing to do with having heard the Vedas and gotten the wrong definition of what the self is. It actually has absolutely nothing to do with that. That is incidental to the innate problem that you have. Incidental in the sense that somebody who has that wrong view then goes on to write stuff down that reinforces that wrong view later. But in the first place, the wrong view that the innate wrong view, misperception, is what leads to philosophical and religious wrong view later on down the line. And just counteracting this at the level of belief and so forth, all of these ideas doesn't fix the problem actually. According to Buddhist psychology, if you change religions and your religion just changes your beliefs about what the self is and so forth, that isn't enough to fix this problem. You need actual wisdom, which comes through analyzing how reality exists and seeing how it exists in a deep state of concentration and becoming familiar with that over a long period of time. So, this is the reason I spent or will be spending and have spent so much time on this issue of Hinduism and Buddhism and whether Hinduism existed at the time of the Buddha, etc., is that the Buddha is not responding to Hinduism in the first place. The Buddha is responding to dozens of different philosophical views in at the time. And the Buddhist definition of self doesn't, in a straightforward way, contradict the modern Hindu view of self. Like, I'll give you one small example. I'm going to have an Advaita practitioner on the podcast at sometime in the next few weeks, probably, and he can give his opinion on this. But quite a few Hindu practitioners think that the self doesn't exist. Think about this for a second. The self that you think exists is actually Brahman, is actually the universal creative principle underlying all reality. You think there's a self, but actually, it turns out that when you do deep meditation, that self was never there and you were Brahman the whole time. This is why it's Brahman Atman, not because you have an Atman and you're Brahman. You were just Brahman from the beginning. So explain to me for a moment, when one of you has a spare moment, explain to me why the Buddha would be telling the Hindus that the self that they don't believe exists doesn't exist. Explain to me why the Buddha would be doing that. Because the Buddha's position is actually not these two things. The Buddha said, "It's not my position that you don't have a self. It's not my position that you have a self." This is what the Buddha said. It's not my position that you have a self and don't have a self. And it's not my position that you don't have a self and do have a self. Or that you neither have a self nor don't have a self. So since he's eliminating all four possibilities, how and in what way give me just a moment. So once again, explain to me how and in what way the Buddha is directly contradicting the view that there's a self when he's saying, I'm not saying there's no self. Right? So all of your work is ahead of you if you want to argue that the Buddha's position is that there's no self whatsoever. Right? All of your work is ahead of you. And so you have to, I think, especially as a modern person who's probably heard all of this stuff over and over again, that, oh, the Buddhists are just counteracting the Hindus and blah, 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 blah. That's wrong. Now, this doesn't mean that the Buddhists are saying the same thing as all the Hindu schools. The Hindu schools don't even agree with each other. Likewise, the Buddhist schools don't all agree with each other. So, you know, again, you've got to do a little work to get at what's going on in terms of the most critical issue in Buddhism, which is wisdom. It's not a straightforward issue. And certainly it's not a case where the Buddha is simply responding to another philosophical idea or religious idea that was held in his culture at the time. As a final note, the Buddha is also not simply regurgitating views about rebirth that already existed at the time. The Vedas have no direct teaching about rebirth whatsoever. If somebody would like to go to the Vedas and provide a quote where the Vedas are directly stating unequivocally that rebirth is real and that your actions, karma just means action, leads to rebirth in various types of realms of existence, please post it in the chat. You won't be able to do that because it's not there. But people go, "Oh no, this is a really important central critical part of Hinduism." Yeah, it is. But when did it come about? Because it's not talked about in the Vedas. When did it come about? And then when you look at the Upanishads, the ones that we know were there at the time of the Buddha, the 4 or 5 that we know were there at the time of the Buddha, they also don't have unequivocal statements about rebirth that are any more elaborate than a sentence or two that basically sound like this. If you do good stuff, the gods will approve and will let you get into heaven. If you don't, you have to carry on doing stupid stuff in the world down here with us or as an animal until you earn your place in heaven. That is once again not a particularly, how to say, unique idea in the realm of world religions at the time. Almost everyone from the Jewish tradition, from the Egyptian tradition to apparently the Brahmanical tradition thought your actions will be weighed by the gods and they'll decide if you get to go into heaven or if you have to do something else or if you cease to exist, right? Like this isn't as particularly this isn't particularly like a Buddhist idea whatsoever. The idea that your actions themselves lead to entire environments coming into existence that concord with the actions you performed, and that the gods have no say in it, no part in it whatsoever, is not there at all in Hindu tradition. Sorry, not Hindu tradition, in Vedic and Upanishadic tradition at the time of the Buddha. However, we do have evidence that there were big discussions going on about how all this stuff works. We find that in the Buddhist canon. But if we're just going by the textual tradition, not all the oral traditions and the debates and blah blah blah, it's not there. People were talking about it and debating it and trying to figure it out, but there was no one position that dominated all the other positions. And in the Brahmajala Sutta, the what is it? The all encompassing net of views sutta, there's, what is it, 62, 64 views that the Buddha said these are the things people are talking about right now, and there are even more that he lists in other places. So yeah, all sorts of ideas were flying around at the time, all sorts, big debates. So the idea that that the Buddha was simply following along with what his culture said when he said that you're reborn. Which culture exactly? The agnostics, the materialists, the people who said that the gods do it all, the people who said that every single thing's determined by your actions, the ones who said, who was he following exactly? And then ironically, he was not only just following the people in his culture supposedly, but he was also rejecting them all. So there you go. It's like, again, it's not very well thought through, but this is the sort of argument you see all the time. What would I call Hindu practice pre modern Hindu ideas? Uh, I would call it probably Brahmanical traditions or Vedic traditions or Vedic and Upanishadic traditions. That's what I would say. And then that Vedic, Upanishadic, Brahmanical traditions, multiple, then around the second or third, what is it? Second or third century BCE, about 200, 300 years after the time of the Buddha, then those traditions then start taking on more and more and more of the features that we would consider to be modern Hindu features. So it's still a very early tradition. Well, if we're saying, well, do we have everything there that we would want if we're going to call it Hinduism? Sometime around second, third century BCE, we have all that there. And of course, there's a ton more that gets added on, but the core features are there, right? Like they've incorporated the local deities. They've written some of, I think, the Mahabharata. Uh, a great number more of Upanishads have been written, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's Mahabharata that was already written by that time, and that's one of the markers that a lot of the scholars use. Okay, so why am I talking about all this? So this is a little bit of a hopefully a rumination meditation. So to adjust the attitude that you may have picked up without knowing it from here and there, where you think Buddhism is just a response to Hinduism, or Buddhism is just an outgrowth of Hinduism. And this is a wrong view. This is a completely wrong view. And if you look at your Buddhism through that lens, what you see there will be incorrect. You get the wrong idea about what you're looking at. And I know a lot of people like this, including some people that have been training in Buddhism a long time, because they haven't actually taken a close look at the history. And you should, because if you do that, you'll realize, oh, there's way more diversity going on at the time of the Buddha. He wasn't even in one of the major Brahmanical cities. His city didn't worship the deities and do the practices of the Vedic traditions, but they were underneath Vedic rulership and classed as a certain thing, even though they themselves didn't really consider that to be all that important. Like, this is a very different sort of picture about what was going on in the Shakya area, you know? And then, of course, all around him, surrounding him, were these Shramana traditions and these other teachers who weren't in stuck under the rules of the major powers in the larger cities to the I think to the west of Shakya, right in the Himalayan foothills. So they were doing all sorts of things intellectually, all sorts of things religiously. So you would hope, and this will be the last bit because we've got to get into our practice, but you would hope, Data, that, for example, wouldn't you hope to find some relatively consistent and stable view about what happens when you die, for example? If the only idea that's there is that your actions will be judged by the gods and you get to go to heaven or not, if that's basically the best you get with maybe 4 sentences in the entire canon up to that time in terms of the big questions of life, that's good enough for you to say, "Oh yes, this is full on Hindu understanding of the world now." Because my interpretation of sort of the sophisticated views of Hinduism in terms of karma and in terms of the relationship of the mind to the world, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, extends way beyond that very, very simple idea. And again, I think Brahmanical culture was quite different than what we have today. Okay, let's do some practice. So, right. Uh, for those who might stumble upon this who are into Hindu practices, if you believe that the Dharma is eternal, that it's Sanatan Dharma, I know I'm butchering the pronunciation, but if you believe Dharma is eternal and the truths were always there and they were just waiting to be discovered, or it was all there in the oral tradition and only got written down later, no problem. You know, as a religious person, you can believe whatever you want, no problem. you know, uh, uh, but I don't think the historical picture supports that that idea. And the earliest sources we have seem to contradict some of what we have today that we would assume would have been the bedrock of Brahmanical Vedic Upanishadic culture. It isn't evidenced at the time as being that way. So that's an indication that maybe some of these things came along later or were discovered later or added later or came about in conversation with other religious movements at the time. No problem. There's a ton of stuff in Buddhism that's like that too. In the Mahayana tradition, tons of stuff that came about because Buddhist saints and scholars were interacting with other groups who were challenging them in certain ways or presenting certain ideas, and the Buddhists had to do something, or Buddhism basically would go out of existence, right? They'd be outcompeted in the public sphere for funding, attention, state sponsorship, whatever. I mean, that's caused quite a few religions, I think, to go out of existence over the years, where they're no longer the state religion or whatever. Okay, am I Buddhist or other religion? Yeah, so sugar free. I am Buddhist. I've been Buddhist since I was about 19-ish. I'm 40, going to be 41 this year. Right. Okay. So, relatively simple practice today. Let's do intensive breaths. I think I think everybody here has done this practice before, so instructions will be very brief. So, breathe in through your nose. Place the mind forcefully on a patch of skin inside the nostril or near the nostril where the sensations are strongest. And then count between the in breath and out breath, or rather, between the out breath and in breath, count from 1 to 7, 7 to 0. If you can do it 3 times, that would be probably for most people about 5 minutes. But I'm going to cut it off before that, and we're going to do a body scan. So just carry on counting until I interrupt. 3, 2, 1, begin. Okay. Place the mind in the top of the skull, now the rest of the skull, but not the neck, into the joint between the neck and the skull, the upper third of the neck, middle third, and the lower third. Spend a little bit of extra time on the back of the neck in the lower third. Just let the mind's awareness pool in that area. Pull your awareness from the rest of the body and squeeze it into the back third. Not too tight, just a little bit of extra pressure, bringing the mind into the back third, back lower third of the neck. Into both shoulders, the bicep region on both sides, elbows, forearms, wrists, palms, and the back of your hands. And your fingers. the upper cavity of the chest, so everything from the solar plexus to the small of the neck, front and back. Now the diaphragm belt. So from the solar plexus to the top of the waist, not the top of the hips, the top of the waist. So about 3, 4 inches from down from the solar plexus in a ring stretching around the whole torso of the body. Now the next 3 inches, that's your waist. Everything above the hips, but below the diaphragm. And now the pelvic region. So top of the hips, down to the tailbone, the buttocks, front and back. Squeeze the mind into the tailbone. And then move forward to the anus, perineum, and scan the sexual organs. If you're morphologically male, come to rest at the tip of the organ when you're finished. And morphologically female, come to rest at the most sensitive point. Slide back to the tailbone and then find the hip sockets on both sides, the hip joints. Into the upper thighs, lower thighs, knees, calves, ankles, Heels, the arches, and the top of the foot. And into your toes. Neat. Some of you might find that your mind is a little bit drowsy after this practice. That's typical if you're doing a body scan in a downward direction in particular. It's an extremely calming practice. This is why most often when I teach it moving upward to the top of the head, because it also has in addition to making the mind very, very stable and calm, moving to the top of the head tends to make the mind bright and fresh and awake. Likewise, I tend to teach people this technique, moving in an upward direction in a standing position for the same reason. Harder to get drowsy or the mind to get lax while standing, much harder. So, having said that, some of you also, I hope, probably noticed that the mind can get quite stable, quite calm. Maybe you get some bliss in the body, this sort of thing, from doing body scanning relatively easily. It's a wonderful technique for getting the mind to calm down. It's not a great technique for making the mind bright, lucid, and fresh. Right? So in terms of the way that I teach it, I try to bake into the technique that you end here instead of ending at the feet normally. Nonetheless, just to give you a little bit of variety and have you know this from your own experience, it's good to from time to time try things in different ways. So hopefully you did have the experience that the mind got very calm, but maybe some of you got a little drowsy. Maybe some of you fell asleep for a moment. Maybe some of you noticed that your mind is a little foggy now. So this is laxity. It's a problem that comes up once the mind gets a little bit stable, a little bit calm in meditation. Then laxity comes up. And the classics say the next thing you need to do is address this problem of laxity, because if you stay in it for a long period of time, the mind will get less discerning, less intelligent. I mean, it literally says you'll become stupid because you're training your mind to be less sort of less fresh in its cognitive engagement with objects of experience. Okay, my auntie Nat. Hello, hello. So, in the Buddhist systems, the Kundalini practices are part of Tantra rather than part of the Sutra approach. And because of this, they don't talk about them unless you have Tantric empowerment. In the Taoist systems, very, very similar technique called Neidan, internal alchemy, and it's not behind tantric empowerments. It's something that you can do without empowerment. And usually, it depends on the school, but if you're being a little bit more conservative, shall we say, the approach that you would take to making this process happen is slower and more gradual, and you put a lot more things in place physically, and you do a lot more preparation for the system so that when stuff starts to move, it's not as painful, it's not as dramatic, it doesn't change your psychology from let's say that enlightenment is 100 and normal mind is a 1, let's say. Instead of jumping from 1 to 30, you slowly build up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on up to 30, and then keep going. Because if you make too much change all at once, this can damage your body, it can damage your mind. And if really, really dramatic things change in your personality all of a sudden, this can really screw up everything else you're doing. And since Taoism was primarily taught as a layperson's tradition, it was seen as, well, I don't want to put too many words in the mouths of the Taoists, but my impression is that it is sort of, you need to use those practices that are really transformative and really powerful in such a way that you don't make changes happen that are so rapid that you don't know how to incorporate what's occurred into your life. Yeah. Also, if you use this process in a slightly different way than it's typically taught from what I've seen in the tantras, from what I've seen, the very limited amount that I've seen, the the Taoist approach, you're sort of slowly filling up the whole system at the same time. So instead of just compressing a huge amount of whatever in your lower abdomen so that it shoots up immediately, you're slowly building pressure in the whole system until the whole system becomes really comfortable, full of energy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you're not trying to kick off that process as quickly as you can. You're trying to slowly change the whole system until that process is permanently how your system is, rather than an effect you create by doing certain practices. So, this is one of the differences between the general sort of approach that I've seen on the Buddhist side versus, and I think also from what I've heard of the Hindu side, although I haven't studied that in any great detail, it's a bit different from what they do in the types of Taoist practice that I've seen. And I think the Taoist ones are a little bit safer in that regard. So Lang says it's difficult to not visualize body parts. Yeah, it is. You got to learn how to do it anyway. Because the visualized image is mental content, which means that part of your bandwidth of awareness is going to mental content, which is not your body. Tactile sensation is your body. Mentally visualized image is mental content. So if you're taking bandwidth away from the awareness of the body, then you're not pooling your awareness as much in the body. You're dividing it between two different things. Even if you're imagining stuff here, you could be putting much more of your bandwidth of awareness into the actual hand instead of imagining where the bones are. By the way, if you want to know where the bones are, stop visualizing stuff and feel your hand, and you will feel where the bones are. So, yeah, it's really tough to not visualize body parts. It takes practice. A lot of people visualize and imagine body parts instead of actually feeling them. And you have to do a fair amount of practice to stop doing that. It's a fantastic question because a lot of people have that same issue. When I mentioned tantric things, Bluey is lost. Okay. So depending on where you want to start the clock for tantric stuff, I personally start the clock much earlier than my fellow academics, but that's a long story. Um, there are a whole bunch of methods that make things happen in terms of your practice if you're already excuse me, if you're already a capable practitioner, if you've already studied for a long time, if you've already trained for a long time, if you already have the right kind of character, the right kinds of understandings, the right kinds of realizations that come about due to your ordinary study and practice of Buddhism, let's say, similar to the approach they take in a number of the Taoist schools, by the way, also. The Tao Te Ching, de virtue, right? This term virtue means you need to transform your character, right? Right? So it's not just realizing the Tao all of a sudden, it's transforming your character and realizing the Tao. So in Buddhism, you need to do a lot of work preparing your mind, your emotions, your worldview, your body, if you can. And then you can do certain kinds of techniques that make things happen spiritually, happen in terms of your realizations much, 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 much faster. So that's what Tantra is. It is a large set of techniques that allow you to make progress way faster than normal. But those techniques only work if you're already relatively capable and have realizations from training in the rest of the system. If you just jump into it, it's like jumping into a car, a really fancy look. It's like jumping into a, I don't know, like a Maserati with no engine in it. The engine is all of the stuff you trained in terms of your character and everything in the normal part of the lineage. And then the gasoline is renunciation, bodhicitta, and wisdom. So it's the realizations you gained from doing, those are the main realizations you need gained from doing the normal lineage practices of Buddhism. That's the gasoline. The engine is all of the rest of the stuff going on in your lineage in terms of, just to give you an example. Okay, so one of the deities that's quite important in one of the systems has two horns, right? Now, if you're just a normal person, you look at that and you go, why does the deity have horns and look kind of demonic? One horn is conventional reality, the other horn is ultimate reality. Why does he look wrathful? Because he's confronting suffering and ignorance and delusion with great force, using his understanding of both conventional and ultimate reality. But if you're just sort of hanging out thinking that you're visualizing yourself as some weird demonic looking thing or something, that's probably not so helpful, especially if you're using it while making yourself really pissed off and angry, right? So you're imagining yourself as a more wrathful, angry being that's really scary, and then living your life through that kind of personality, that's hurting you. That's not doing anything to help you, right? So, you know, these techniques only work if you understand what the technology is supposed to be used for, and you've powered it with the engine of the lineage, training in the lineage in the normal way, and then put the gas in the vehicle, which is the critical understandings of the path, the critical realizations of the path that you gain from your ordinary lineage practices that then power what it is you're doing. Johnny, happy birthday. Happy birthday. Now someone's wished you happy birthday. Everyone in the chat can wish you happy birthday. I hope I hope you have an absolutely wonderful year. Good health, good friendships, close relations. That everything goes well. Okay. When one does body scan and not self-guided, with you move through by thinking and so on, then it's automatically there, the mental image, because the command to focus on the head is mental. So body scanning, because it is in part an analytical meditation, involves some degree of conceptual thought. But that's different than visualizing, imagining the body part. You need a certain amount of conceptual thought that says, I'm only going to look at this chunk of my body. That's true. And you're also hearing the word hand and understanding that the word hand is referring to the instructions you got previously of place your mind on the hand non conceptually, pooling the awareness there, pulling it from your other five senses and your conceptual mind until the center of your awareness moves to your hand, and the only thing that exists is the tactile sensations in the hand. That's the instruction. So when you hear the word hand, you should recall, which is the definition of mindfulness, right? Mindfulness means memory. You should recall the instructions you got previously and then actively act, which is the other definition of mindfulness, right? Active memory, long term memory, active memory. Then actively act by placing all of the bandwidth of awareness in the tactile sensations of the hand without visualizing anything, imagining anything, etc. And moving the awareness to the hand, into the hand, where the central point of awareness now appears to be in the hand instead of in your head or inside your heart, etc. Right? So yeah, that involves a certain amount of conceptual thinking because you have divided some part of the unit and said, I'm going to focus on this part of the unit. But you've also doing the same thing with your breath. You have to divide a little piece out of some little piece of skin that's relatively arbitrary near your nose or in your nose and focus on that. So also this is requires a certain amount of conceptual thought. But if you don't remember the instructions and you just do whatever you want when you get to the hand, like visualizing it and this and that and this and that, and you know, then of course that's not going to lead to the results that I'm talking about. Likewise, if you're visualizing the hand, I think it's going to be very difficult for you to move the central point of your awareness into the hand. Because for most of us, when we visualize stuff, we go like this. We go, visualize thing, me over here, looking at it from over here. Probably you're going like this. I'm visualizing my hand over here and I'm seeing it from here, which means you're definitely in a state of dual awareness, not non-dual awareness. So you need to be placing the awareness in the actual tactile sensations. And one of the effects of this will be over the long term that when you place the awareness there and pull all the rest of the awareness to the hand, the central point of the awareness moves to here. So it seems like, for lack of a better term, you are here, not here looking at your hand. You're here in the hand, experiencing the tactile sensations, inseparable from them. that's that's in the hand, right? So when you hear the word hand, bang, wrist, bang, forearm, bang. The central point of awareness moves there, and this is where all the bandwidth of awareness is, and there's nothing else. Or not nothing else, because, you know, we're not great meditators, but yeah, I mean the important thing is you don't want to imagine a bunch of stuff. It's really, really, really easy to sit there and go, "Oh, I'm seeing between the atoms of my hand, and I'm feeling the energy field, and oh, the whole thing's vibrating, and blah blah blah." That's all mental content. That's you thinking about stuff and imagining it and trying to analyze it and figure out what it's like. If you're doing all of that, you're not in the hand. So you have to just, again, the instructions are so simple that they sound maybe maybe they're so simple they sound like, oh, that can't be it. That's it. Put your attention in the hand, the actual things you feel in the hand. That's the whole instruction. Put it in the hand. If your mind does anything else besides putting the attention in the tactile field of the hand, you have lost the lost the how to say lost the object of meditation. Your mind's doing something else. Yeah, you're actually feeling the hand. Okay. Uh, Stronger sensation, like the pleasure of the chair, is easier to focus on than subtler ones. Yeah, yeah. Oh, sorry. Are Buddhist themes dreams a side effect of the effort? Not always. No, that's not a bad sign though. If you're doing practice, especially because I'm not teaching it as Buddhist stuff all the time, but if you're doing practice and then all of a sudden you start having dreams about Buddhist stuff, that's a relatively good sign. You know, I'm not huge on dream interpretation and stuff, but if you start dreaming about monks and nuns and doing practice in your sleep and all this stuff, that's a sign that you're probably headed the right way. uh so luck, yes. If you do feel the hand and you can feel that there's movement there or whatever, that's fine. Just don't get drawn in by the movement because your object is the whole hand, not following the movement of stuff or trying to see, oh, I feel it's vibrating and it's sort of at this frequency and blah blah blah. Because the mental chatter related to trying to figure out what it is and apply a term to it and a definition to it, et cetera, is mental content, not feeling the hand. Does that make sense? Okay, so for Lang's question, is it? Yeah, generally speaking, it is easier to focus on parts of the body where you feel more sensation there. But you also need to get good at, I've done this before, but if you close your eyes, right, you can still hear me with your eyes closed. So if you close your eyes, you immediately become aware that there's an absence of visual experience and that the visual experience becomes mostly the color black, the color of the absence of light. So the visual experience becomes the absence of visual objects besides the color black, right? I mean, if you look closely, there's some red, probably some yellow. There's a little bit of this, a little bit of that. And then your mind will start projecting light onto the back of your eyelids and other weird things will happen. But if you set all that aside, by way of analogy, when you place the mind into a part of the body, uh, if you place the mind into a part of the body where there's not very much sensation, that's a bit like your eyes being closed relative to that part of the body. Does that make sense? You can't open your eyes in that part of the body and see what's there. But you should, just like if with your fingertip, for example, probably this one in particular, and maybe your thumb, when you put your mind there, huge amounts of awareness there right away because there's lots of nerves there, right? When you try to put your mind here or on your tailbone, very little sensation. But you should become aware, vividly aware, that I'm opening my eyes, so to speak, to look at the elbow, and it's a completely dark room. And you focus just on whatever actually appears there when you place the attention there, even if nothing appears. Does that make sense? So you should become vibrantly, vividly aware that you're not feeling sensations in that part of the body when you arrive at a part of the body where there's no sensations. In the same way that you become vibrantly, vividly aware that there are tactile sensations there when you arrive at a part where there are tactile sensations. The quality of the awareness that's moving through is the same, whether or not you feel a lot of sensation or don't. But you're not going to feel them all equally. The quality of your mind should be the same because you have a vivid, bright, intense awareness that's highly stable on that part of the body. But that doesn't mean that the amount of sensation that's there will be the same. Some parts will be dark and some parts will be really lit up. Yeah. So you can think if your body was a tunnel, right? You were driving through the tunnel. Maybe here there's a lot of light at the front of the tunnel and you go through and this is all dark, but you know you're going through a dark tunnel. right? And then you come out to the other side and now it's all lit up again. And you don't spend time, how to say, sort of analyzing and thinking and trying to figure it out and well, can I get into this and blah, 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 blah. If you're doing all that, again, that's all mental content. So instead, just let your mind soak in to the dark area in the same way that you let it soak in to the area that's already lit up. Eventually it will brighten up in areas where it's dark, but you do that by simply soaking into the dark areas without trying to do anything special there. And then eventually, like I said, you can feel all sorts of things inside the body. And then for those of you who are interested in the Lohan thing, for example, being able to feel your way into the body. One of the students here is into Qigong, which is also part of the Lohan curriculum eventually. So for Qigong, for example, there's a lot of Qigong that's just more or less sort of breathing exercises, a bit of stretching, a bit of, sort of relatively normal biodynamic sort of physical exercise kind of stuff. But there are some that are based upon, as I've said many times, for lack of better terms, sort of subtle physical substances that appear in the tactile field of awareness. So when you start to learn how to place the mind into your internal organs, for example, it becomes clear to you that the organs, each of them has a different feeling in your tactile awareness. They don't feel the same. They don't, in terms of the quality of what's there when you place the mind in there, the substances that seem to be there aren't the same as they are in other places in the body. And so one of the things that the great meditators of the past from China, coming through the Taoist traditions and Shaolin Temple and, 18 Lohan Palm, like what Shifu Neil Ripsky is doing, is that if you learn how to sort of, not sort of, but if you learn how to actually meet these tactile sensations of the stuff in the body, including the organs, you can start moving those sensations around. You can actually grab onto them and move them other places and do stuff with them. And you can take the raw material, so to speak, of the vitality of the body and move more of it into a particular organ, and that changes your emotional palette. So there are all of these exercises where you do different things with the stuff you happen to find in the body. And as I said, I'm an extremely skeptical person. I won't say who, but I have people in my wider network who believe that crystals will heal your cancer and whatever. And I've just never been one of those people, and I've always been skeptical of this stuff. And it took one of my teachers showing me some pretty weird stuff for me to think, okay, this stuff is there's actually something to this. And then also for those who are interested, there's a bunch of research on tumo, which I'll put in the chat. Oh, that's definitely not how you spell it. Let me delete that for posterity. So tumo, yeah, like aura healing and all that, like so many weird things out there, man. So many weird energy things out there, which is why I hate the term energy. It's just, it's first of all, we have a relatively good understanding of what energy is. And based on all the research I've seen done on Qigong masters and even people like in Tukdam, the documentary yogis, the Tukdam documentary, Meditation Beyond Death, the yogis who meditate beyond death. Great example, because what they say is you pool all the winds, all the prana, you pool all the kundalini, etc. You pool all of the stuff that makes you alive at the time of death in the central point in the heart, and you remain there, and you cognize, know, become familiar with the subtlest type of consciousness that occurs at the time of death. And if you stay there for a period of days, then what ends up happening is, because the mind hasn't left the body doesn't decay. Clinically, the body is dead. I mean, scientists have studied these folks. They sometimes, for up to something like 45 days in the heat of the Indian summer without being protected from insects and everything else. These people's bodies will remain fresh and pliant as if alive. They look like they're sleeping, but there's no heartbeat, no breathing, no brain activity. In any case, one of the signs that they haven't left the body is that when you put your hand over their heart, you feel heat. And they've done scientific measurements of people where you can feel heat. See you later, Hans. Uh, but the body is not physically warm. And again, quite interesting. But one of the things that you feel these vital forces, for lack of a better term, these vital sub-physical forces that are in the body, etc. When somebody forces them into your body, it feels like electricity and heat quite often for people. So quite interesting that you can put your hand over someone's heart area and you go, oh yeah, it feels sort of static electricity and warm, still warm, and they're in there. And then when that goes away, the body starts to decay, right? So in any case, if you look at Tumo research, if you look at Tukdam research, if you look at Qigong research, it's pretty clear that whatever these substances aren't energy. Energy is the potential of matter to do stuff, and that's not what we're talking about. You know, that's not what it is. First of all, secondly, it's not like bioelectric energy. That would be, I don't know, the electromagnetic field that your heart produces when it's beating or something. That's not what this is. We could measure that. We could measure that if that's what it was, and we can't measure this. Okay, I digress. I mean, the point is that uh, for those who are interested in qigong and neigong and these other things where you're working with these kinds of things, it's all there in the Lohan system. So maybe the moderator can put that in the chat again. Uh, if you want to do those things at a relatively high level, competent level, you have to have extremely refined tactile awareness of the body. That's the doorway to being able to do those practices. So when you're doing the earlier parts of systems that are legitimate, that teach you how to work with those things, part of that training regimen has to be becoming extremely aware of the tactile sensations in the body. Otherwise, very, very difficult to do those things. There are ways to sort of make it happen anyway, but if you want to gain direct access, you need tactile awareness, very strong tactile awareness. Oh, that was a bit of a weird digression. Bauer body scan techniques, trauma body. Okay, yeah. That's another aspect. Um, what all the yogis and the Taoists sorted out is that if you work with the body and the energy system, etc., that you can work out huge amounts of your negative emotions without having to work through them one by one in sort of like rumination meditation style ways. You can work them out by working with the body and working with the energy system, because those minds depend upon the body and the energy system to produce that kind of activity in the first place. So you can, once again, it's like Neil said on the podcast, you can work at this from the side of the mind and go all the way. You can work at it from the side of the body and get a fair distance, and the energy system and go a pretty fair distance. Or you could take all three and point them in the same direction. And that's going to be incredibly powerful, because now your body and your energy system aren't fighting your mind. They're all headed this way. You don't have all this stuff stored in one part of your system that's taking you the wrong way. Increasingly, all of you is headed the same way. That makes it quite helpful. And to make it a bit more practical, as some people know now from doing Lohan practice as an example, but you could do Hindu yogas, you could do other things. But again, I find the Chinese systems for this to be particularly rich with detail and layers and building a lot more stuff into one package than what I've seen of the popular yoga systems. Because Lohan has stuff like yoga too. It's called Doyen. And that's one out of 400 things that the system has. Okay. So what's really sort of quite practical about things of this kind in terms of your training is that if you're working with your physical body, and you're trying to make, somebody said recently, oh, well, I sit down and I can't remember exactly what they said, but something like, you get to 15 or 20 minutes or 30 minutes, and then your body becomes an obstacle because it's not comfortable. Who said this? I can't remember who I was talking to. I think this was one of my seniors, one of my senior students. I may be badly misquoting him, but this is this is an experience that most of us can relate to, right? You're trying to sit there for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour. Certainly, if you're trying to sit there for 2 hours, the body needs to be set up really well for you to be able to sit that long and for the body to be comfortable. If your body's not set up well, it'll be uncomfortable in a very short period of time, and then the body starts becoming an obstacle to the practice. So, anyways, this is part of why more than one system. Hinduism has ways of dealing with this. Buddhism has ways of dealing with this. Taoism has ways of dealing with this. Shaolin has ways of dealing with this, so that the body and the energy system aren't obstacles to the mental practices you're doing. They're a support for that practice that you're doing with your mind. So, just for people who stumble through later and haven't heard me say this a million times already, I'll put this in the chat. Oh, by the way, for those of you who have already a million times heard me talk about Lohan Palm, last night I pulled an all-nighter, and I've been spending huge amounts of time researching the lineage and trying to get details on the Lohan lineage, and have gotten receipts for most of the little details that I wanted to scratch the itch with. I wanted to scratch the itch as an academic. Not that I didn't believe Neil. I do believe Neil, but I wanted to scratch the itch and have a receipt for certain things, right? And so now on the website, there's a whole lineage section where the details of the lineage are there, and there's photos and things from what I found from all the research, and the research is still going on, so we'll probably find more things. Also, three of Neil's senior students from over the years are now listed on the website. So people who want to train in Lohan in the online course who happen to be in the area of those people can also go train in real life with people who know the system, up to whatever level they know the system. So that's now all on the website for Lohan Palm. And since we're wrapping up, anybody who wants to see me in real life, most of the retreats I'm going to do probably over the next 5 to 10 years will be Lohan meditation retreats. So we'll do Lohan Palm and we'll do meditation as one joint endeavor. Because if you're going to do a lot of seated practice, you need something physical to help you manage what you're doing in your seated sessions. The body will get too uncomfortable otherwise. So I'll be doing combined retreats with Neil, probably as my primary in-person thing. So if you want to do practices with me in real life, highly recommend you sign up for Lohan Palm and get on the train early. Otherwise, when I do my practices with people intensively, I do at least up to this point, I've done all of my retreats with my students online because I like people to be able to do practices at home. I like people to sort out all of the maddening details that are required to sort out in real life to do your retreat where you are so that you know how to do 10 hours of practice in your home. You know how to sort out your schedule to do intensive practice where you are, and you know how to manage all the distractions that will inevitably come up when you get out of retreat. You know how to manage them because you've done retreat right where you are before. You've already done intensive practice right there. So this is how I train people for retreat. And then, for example, then later, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, you go on an away retreat, let's say, with a great teacher somewhere. You do really great practice. Some things happen. You know how to bring more of that practice back home because you've done retreat at home. And you have techniques, hopefully, from the 5 foundations. You have techniques for taking those results back into your real life, right? So this is what on the whole, this is what I'm trying to do, you know? If you have physical stuff taking you the right way from Lohan, if you have energetic training taking you the right way from Lohan, if you have mental stuff from the Five Foundations course and from Lohan taking you the right way also, that also allows you to apply this to real life and expand the circle of what training means until more and more and more of your life is sort of embraced by the training, so to speak, is powered by training, is transforming your mind as you do it. Then there's enough time, maybe if we're lucky, there's enough time in a single lifetime to make some real progress. Okay. Hey Jay, good to see you. I'm just signing off right now. Work hard, everyone. Hope to see you again very soon. Try not to die before I do. Cheers.